Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today as together we study God's Word in the Unfolding the Word series. We're in the midst of the book of Daniel. Yesterday we began to examine chapter 6, which marked a major change in the chronology of the book and in the unfolding of history. I'm going to read again our verses that we started on yesterday in Daniel chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Again, you remember chapter 5 ends with the final death throes of the Babylonian Empire, the time of King Belshazzar, who is a weak and prideful king who is disciplined by God, and we see the events in the very last night of the empire as the Medo-Persian Empire surrounding the city of Babylon, the capital of Babylon, has diverted the water by a dam, worked their way into the city, defeated the city, killed Belshazzar and all of his lords, except for Daniel. Now, Darius the Mede, as we saw yesterday, is now ruling over the province of Babylon on behalf of Cyrus, who is the overall emperor of the Medo-Persian connection. We yesterday talked about it a little bit. Darius shows up in historical records. He was formerly in Nebuchadnezzar's court because the Medes were an ally of the Babylonians back in Nebuchadnezzar's day. That was, remember, Nebuchadnezzar had been dead for 23 years when the kingdom finally was destroyed. As a representative to the very court of Nebuchadnezzar, inevitably, it would have been true that his path crossed with Daniel, because during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Daniel was still the respected one, the second in command. He probably met him, certainly knew about him. And now into chapter 6, 23 years later, after a period of relative obscurity for Daniel, we see Daniel respected by this new ruler, not put to death the way the rest of the rulers and nobles of Babylon had been. He not only doesn't put Daniel to death, but as we saw yesterday, Darius puts Daniel into the new leadership structure. Also yesterday, just as a bridge to what we're looking at today, I pointed out to you the timing of all of this. The timing of these actions, of the changeover of the kingdoms, the elevation of Daniel back into a position of leadership, overlapped the decision made during the first year of Cyrus's reign over the Medo-Persian Empire, and that was the decision dictated by God, prophesied by Jeremiah, that an edict would go out that would permit the 70 years of exile to be finished and for the Jews to return to Judea, and Jerusalem. And as we said yesterday, in God's sovereign working in both the hearts of Cyrus about the larger decree and Darius about his administrative structure, God had set the stage for his people to return. The one charged with the chief administrative responsibilities in the region where most of these exiled Jews would be has now become Daniel upon the decision of Darius the Mede. Now, that's our bridge. That's where we've come to. Let's continue to unfold it a bit as we understand this transitional time where the head of gold is now gone, the shoulders and arms of silver, the Medo-Persian Empire, has now taken control. Within this Medo-Persian Empire, there was a different administrative structure than it existed under the Babylonian Empire. And that's not unusual if you think about it. Anytime a region has been taken over by another nation or another country, the administrative structures change, the judicial structures change, the political structures change. And that's what was going on here. Cyrus, as the emperor, undisputed emperor, by the way, of the Medo-Persian conglomeration, as emperor and ruler, he oversaw all of the empire, which was stretching over a large region, larger than had been controlled by the Babylonian Empire at its greatest extent. Cyrus, prompted by God, had broken the broad empire into 20 provinces, call them countries, if you would, that are all under his control. He had broken them into 20 provinces. And over each of the provinces, smaller geographic regions, he had set what he called a king. Cyrus, the overall emperor, had appointed Darius to be the king, quote, of the Babylonian province, the former capital of Babylon, and the regions surrounding it, what had been the central region of the Chaldeans. Now, this Darius, let me make a comment about him. The word Darius is a title, not a personal name. The word Darius means scepter holder. And so it's like the word emperor is not a personal name, it's a description of a position. Darius was the scepter holder over this region. We know from other documents of that era and writings, historical writings that we have, that the personal name of Darius, in this case, was Gubaru. And that name, as Gubaru the Mede, shows up in a number of the inscriptions of the period. On the province level now, God has worked to put Darius in this position. On the province level, as king, he had responsibility to organize that province. Each province could be organized differently. In the case of Darius, he decides, I want to set over my province 3 chief administrators. The ESV translation uses the word presidents, although I think that's a bit misleading in terms of the role of these people. Perhaps premiers or prime ministers might be a better term. The New American Standard Version in the English translates it commissioners. The NIV, the New International Version, translates the same Hebrew word as administrators. And I think that's really probably the best in this case because it describes the role that was being carried out by these 3 people. They were the chief administrators, the chief responsible ones. In a corporate sense, they would be the chief vice presidents. In the political sense, they were the ones who were the chief administrators. Underneath these 3 overarching administrators would be 120 satraps who were carrying out sort of mid-level management over the province. 120 satraps reporting to these 3, probably in this case 40 satraps reporting to each of these 3 administrators. And now you see what God has done. He has moved Daniel into one of the positions of the 3 top administrators. Daniel, who had been living in obscurity after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, has now been brought back, not only having a significant role as the empire of Babylon ends, but now has become a powerful and respected leader in the new empire. And predictably, what emerges with that elevation in leadership is the problem of jealousy on the part of other people toward Daniel. Daniel, as he's now in this new position within the Medo-Persian Empire, is in his early 80s. And yet, even then, it tells us here that he was showing exceptional qualities, that he was distinguished above the others. There was an excellent spirit within him. How much is this like chapter 1 of the book of Daniel, where Daniel is a young teenager standing before King Nebuchadnezzar. The king spoke with them, verse 19 and 20 in chapter 1. And among them was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired, he found them 10 times better than everybody else. The same thing was continuing to hold true. He was sharp. And as it became clear that he was better at this job than anybody else, King Darius says, I think I'm going to shift the administrative structure. I'm going to put Daniel over the other two administrators and create more of a pyramid because I have more confidence in him than I have in anyone else. Then the irony there is that puts him in a place then where he would have been in exactly the same role that he was under Nebuchadnezzar, remember, because he was second in the kingdom at that particular point in time. But of course, as I say, the problem that emerges here is that the other leaders became jealous of him, the other two administrators and the satraps under him. In their jealousy of him, we see in these opening verses, turned to hatred as they began to plot his downfall. And one of the things we see here is that all of these other rulers conspired together. So there were none of them that were opposed to the intrigue and the plot. People never change. What we see here is that people hate God's people as a group, and they hate the individual Jew, the child of God, the person of God, the people of God who's moved into a higher position, demonstrating the skills and gifts that God has given them. This was an era of hatred toward the Jews. As you turn to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther books, we see that hatred taking form in various ways as the people sought to attack the Jews and kill them all. And it's continuing even into our current era. Well, join me tomorrow as we continue to examine the new era with Daniel and the plot of the opposers. God bless.